thanks for joining me this evening to talk about everyone's favorite topic, college standardized tests. I'm really excited and very honored that we get to have a testing expert come talk to us because while I know some generalities about testing, and obviously I do advisement about it, I think once we get into kind of the nitty gritty about the different tests, which ones are best for a child. Usually I really do defer to the experts and the pros on this. So ArborBridge is my preferred test prep provider, and I send everyone their way. So I've got Morris here. He can introduce himself a little bit better than me. And then he's gonna just walk us through a lot of the kind of the common questions and concerns that I often get about the process. So whether you are a junior and you're like, oh my gosh, it's coming up, and you're panicking about what's happening, or maybe you're a freshman or a sophomore and you're at least starting to think about the process, this webinar is going to be really helpful to kind of set the groundwork and let you understand what are the things you should start thinking about. What are some things you can maybe table for a little while, but at least know that these things are on the horizon. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Morris. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Karen. Glad to be here. Absolutely delighted. And hello, Rutgers Edge students. As Karen said, my name is Morris Kohanfars. I'm a director of tutoring at ArborBridge. What that essentially means is that students are sent my way and I help evaluate them and figure out which test, the SAT or ACT, is best for them, help them through AP prep, help set them up essentially. But even before that, I've been working in the field of test prep for 8-9 years at this point. Used to be a former SAT, ACT tutor myself, designed the curriculum. So I know a fair bit about this exam, more than I'd like to admit. But yeah, so right now we're going to chat a little bit about some of the more confusing questions people have. We'll look at today's agenda. We're going to cover test optional and test blind policies, figure out what the differences are, what they mean. Do students actually need to take the test? All that good stuff. We'll dive into the SAT and the ACT and what the differences are between the paper-based exams that some students will take. And then we'll dive a little bit into the digital SAT and give a little overview of what that test is going to be like for the students that might need to take that exam. And we'll leave some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in chat. Karen, you could feel free to stop me if there's a pressing question, and we'll take it from there. But let's start with the fun stuff. The confusing nature of today's exams with tests optional.
Let's just make this more confusing. Everyone's always like, why? I thought we figured it out. I'm like, no, we're just going to keep making it.
This made it worse. This makes it far more complicated.
Yes.
Because now students not only have to take the ACT or SAT, but now they have to decide if it's going to be valuable to send that score to schools. And something like a crazy figure I was reading was something like 4% of schools now require the SAT and ACT. Only 4%. So 96% are either test optional or test blind. It's just 4% at this point require the SAT and ACT. So figuring out what this means and what students should do is a big question for families. So I like to start by chatting about the differences between test blind and test optional, because that's always the first question I get. So what's going on? Test blind essentially means that even if you submit an SAT or an ACT with your applications, schools won't even look at the score report. They'll only consider things like the GPA, letter of recommendations, extracurriculars, and other things along those lines. And with test blind policies, even if you do submit those scores, they just won't even look at them. And maybe they won't even give you an option to submit those scores. UCs and CSUs are a great example of test blind universities. They don't ask for your score report. They don't want to see your score report. They'll only evaluate you on the three things and the three things listed on this page. Now with test optional schools, they give you the option to submit an SAT or an ACT, but it's not required. With these policies, we've found that fewer than half of applicants actually submit their SAT or ACT despite loosening COVID-19 restrictions. So, with test optional policies being active, only 48% of students actually choose to submit their test scores with applications. Without test scores, sorting applicants by GPA or academic rigor can be kind of tricky. I don't know if an A in one honors geometry course is the same as an A in a completely different geometry course at a completely different school. But despite all of this, schools are saying that they give each student a fair shot, whether or not they choose to submit these scores. But what the statistics show us is that test optional universities prefer applicants who submit scores. I'll show you that here. Now, very few schools actually release their data, but for those schools that do, it's clear that that taking a test and submitting a score has a little bit of an advantage. For instance, looking at Boston College, of those accepted students, 66% had a test score and 33% didn't. So just based on acceptance rates, it's clear that there's an advantage there. Looking at UVA, for instance, 72% of students that got accepted had a test score and only 28% didn't. Georgetown is a clear outlier here. 90% had a test score and only 10% didn't. And Brown, even though the difference is small, 58% had a test score and 42% didn't. Now, keep in mind that the number of students that are submitting scores is still hovering around 48%. So the fact that less than half of students are submitting scores, but a majority of those that are being selected to a few of these institutions that have scores means that there is a clear advantage. Now, let me try and get to the next slide here. Now, looking at the kind of admissions advantage here, there is some data out there saying that there is a clear advantage for students that submit a score report. And that advantage can be 1.1 times as much, all the way to 2.7 times as much, meaning that just having a test score and submitting it gives you a 2.7 times higher chance of getting in, despite test optional policies being in place. So the big question for students is, should you submit a score or not? The fact is, your choice to not submit will also be factored into your admissions decision. But what's clear is that schools tend to prefer students who submit scores. All students need to take a diagnostic to see where they're scoring, and they need to set goals before deciding whether they should submit scores or not. That's the biggest takeaway here. Before you decide whether or not you want to go forward with test optional policies, take a diagnostic and see where you're scoring and see if a goal that's within reach is possible. Now, in terms of goal setting, what you really want to try and shoot for is maybe shoot for above the median of what the previous freshman class scored. So take a diagnostic, see how you're scoring, look at the median of the freshman class of the previous year, and get a sense of where you actually need to be. Is it going to be realistic? And then after you've done the diagnostic testing, after you've taken time to really assess whether your goal is attainable, careful consideration needs to be taken with a college counselor. I can't stress that enough. Talk to Karen, ask for her thoughts. As soon as you see your diagnostic score, look at that goal, see if your goal is attainable, and then schedule a call with Karen, chat with Karen, see what needs to happen. Because the choice of whether to submit scores or not, it's going to be a complicated one. And in some cases, even if you're taking this test and your score might be high, it might be within, it might be reasonable not to submit that score at all. What are your thoughts here, Karen? I'd love to hear your take on
so two things that I want to make sure that families are aware of, because I get asked this every year. So if you're further along in the process, let's say you're a junior now and you're thinking you already have scores or you're going to have scores soon, um, when you apply, so for example, if you're going to use the common application, you can, not only is it test optional to a particular school, but it's among like your entire list of schools. So I've had students that apply through the common application, and some of them they submit a score and they do self-report it there, and others they might submit those ones, and then the next round of colleges they decide not to submit the score, so they do go back in the application and delete those out and not report it.
Mhm.
So I do want to make sure students understand that for each individual college they can make that decision. Okay, Karen, what do you think? Should we send it to Brown or should we not? So that would be one decision. And then also we might look at your entire college list and say, okay, those first five, let's send scores to, but based on what that what their common data set was last year or those sorts of things, I think these last four, let's not send scores. We think it would actually hurt you in the process, and we obviously would talk about whether or not these tests are going to be helpful. And that's really what we're looking at is, if you don't send the scores, the idea is, that the test optional piece is it's not going to be held against you. It's just literally just a spot that it's just not there to help you, right?
Mhm.
So obviously talk with your high school counselor, talk with someone like me, whoever, and then have that discussion about whether or not it makes sense. The second thing, because I've had students ask me this too, or families, when we say take a diagnostic, so that could be similar to the PSAT or a practice ACT at your school. So if you've done that already, that's one. But if there's another test, and we'll kind of get, I know Morris is going to get into the differences between the two. If your school has only given you a PSAT and you've never taken an ACT, you would go to a company like ArborBridge. They would host that diagnostic, because I have families, well, where do we go? Like, do we have to ask our high school? Do we have whatever? You would contact Morris and you would say, hi, my child has never taken an ACT. Can we schedule a diagnostic ACT? And they would take care of all of it. So that would give us a really objective other score of the other tests and be able to decide, is one better than the other. So if you're worried about
Yep.
like where you don't have to go anywhere, like ArborBridge will take care of you, but taking the diagnostic is really, really important. I was going to ask you, Morris, do you feel like is taking a diagnostic as like a freshman, is that too early or is that okay? Do you know what I mean? Is there a good time where you feel like it's the most helpful or not?
Yeah. I think a freshman might be a little early. We'll dive into that a little bit.
Perfect.
But just to answer your question right out the gate, usually what I use as a gauge for students' readiness for the SAT or ACT, or at least diagnostic testing, is Algebra 2. If a student has completed Algebra 2, that's a clear indicator that they have the skills necessary to, at the bare minimum, take a diagnostic. Whether or not they'll take the test is a completely different question. But if they're ready to take a diagnostic, I know they're going to be ready to take a diagnostic if I've seen Algebra 2 on their transcript.
Great.
Great question.
Great.
And I love the idea of submitting the application, submitting the score report to schools in a very, smart manner, a very logical manner, where you'll submit to some schools where it's going to give you an advantage and other schools where it might not. I love that take on it as well. But with that said, let's jump into some more of the fun stuff. Let's jump into the SAT versus the ACT. So now that we know there's a little bit of an advantage for students that are scoring well on this exam, obviously, submitting their score, the big question is, should you take the ACT or should you take the SAT, and what's the difference? So there's a lot of nitty-gritty details between the two tests, but the root of the distinction between these two tests is pretty simple, and have a little picture to help us out here. We like to think of the SAT as more of a slow, deliberate test, and sort of like a tortoise, slow and deliberate, whereas the ACT is more so a hare. So the SAT's math section has a much narrower focus. Mostly, it's going to test the fundamentals that students learn in Algebra 2, statistics, geometry. But the test explores those concepts at a deeper level than the ACT does because it has longer questions that students are given more time to solve. ACT's math, by contrast, covers a huge variety of topics, but it skips across those topics by just providing a surface level testing of those topics. On the verbal side of things, SAT's reading it has been more challenging for students. It's longer passages that require a greater degree of inference and tests the students' abilities to identify and pair claims and evidences. And students are, again, given more time per question. In contrast, ACT's reading is essentially just a fast-paced treasure hunt, where students are given less than a minute per question to find details that are plainly stated in the passages. And the ACT science section is much of the same, almost purely a test about speed rather than critical thinking. So we like to say that the SAT actually stands for slower analytical test, whereas the ACT is the accelerated content test. Or to use a related cliche, the SAT is a marathon, the ACT is just a series of sprints. Yeah, I love these little images. So whether you choose to take the SAT marathon or the ACT series of sprints, knowing the exam timeline and figuring out a good pace when taking the exam can help students maximize their scores. Both tests take just about 3 or 4 hours when a student doesn't have accommodations, that is. So here's how each test breaks down by section. The SAT has 3 main sections: reading, writing language, and math, whereas the ACT has 4: English, reading, math, and science. Now, the SAT no longer has the essay portion, the ACT does, but it's optional, does not contribute to a student's composite score, and in most cases is not a significant factor in the college admissions process. I haven't seen a student take an essay portion in years at this point. I don't know about your students, Karen, but
no,
I have not.
I'm surprised. I'm still surprised they even offer it, but I have not had students take it.
Same here. I asked this question of our ops team of whether or not they've seen a student take the essay portion, and it's been quite some time since we've seen it. But yeah, let's take a closer look at the differences between each section. So the SAT's reading test is 65 minutes long, and students have to answer 52 questions. Whereas the ACT's reading is 35 minutes long, and you have to answer 40 questions. So now you have less than a minute per question. The hair analogy is really coming to play here. And once again, it's just about the marathon versus the sprint. The grammar portions, the writing and language, and the English tests are broadly the same in content. Though again, the SAT gives the student fewer questions and more time to answer them than the ACT. Looking at the math sections, let's first start with the 2 logistical differences between the 2: calculators and scores. Moving on to the back half of each test, the SAT math is split into 2 sections, one with no calculator and one where calculators are permitted. The ACT's math is just a single section that students can use their calculators on with each and every question. In comparison to the ACT, SAT math tests fewer topics, so the content of its questions tend to be a little bit more predictable, but the SAT's problems are longer. And although questions mostly test concepts that are less advanced, the way those concepts are tested can be trickier, which really just means that the SAT math questions have more overt traps in their answers. To offset this, students are given more time per question. By contrast, ACT math tests a huge variety of concepts, but again, only a surface level complexity, and it's far quicker pace of an exam. So here's an approximate breakdown of the math content that's tested on the SAT versus the ACT. For most students, the time to take the SAT, as I said a little bit earlier, is right after completing Algebra 2. So usually we target June or August test dates, and typically it's the sophomore year of a student's, you know, high school career. The trig fundamentals that you see here can easily be taught in test prep. Most trig and pre-calc concepts are introed in Algebra 2 anyways. So the knowledge gap between students in Algebra 2 and students in pre-calc is really not as big as you'd expect. Now, while Algebra 2 contents make up the bulk of the SAT, in this case, it's set 57%, Algebra 1 skills are still required to solve 80% of the questions on the SAT. By Algebra 1 skills, I mean things like translating word problems, working with variables, solving equations. Algebra 1 skills tend to be the heart of mathematical literacy or numeracy. What we might describe as students' reasoning skills are actually just a symptom of having a strong Algebra 1 toolkit. So Algebra 1 is incredibly important for a student's performance on the SAT or ACT. And like with the SAT, for most students, the best time to take the ACT is sometime after completing Algebra 2. There's a few key differences. With geometry being the key difference here, it is a much larger portion of the ACT than it is the SAT. Often advanced math students have set their geometry formulas and knowledge aside while they went to Algebra 2 or pre-calc, or in rare cases, they're already in calculus. So the heavy focus on geometry is like a huge problem for these students because they've taken geometry so very long ago. I worked with students who took geometry maybe in 7th grade and they're taking the test in their junior year. So it's geometry can be a really key problem area for some of these students that choose to take the ACT or the SAT. So if you've taken Algebra 2, you're probably ready to take any one of these tests. If you don't have a strong foundational knowledge in geometry, maybe slightly leaning toward the SAT, but realistically, the best thing to do is take a diagnostic, take both tests, and I can help you figure out from there what the best next steps would be. Now let's take a look at the biggest difference, the science section. I get so many questions about the
I
science
have
section,
so many
Karen.
students that are scared. They're like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
what's science? So I'm so glad you're going to talk about this.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest questions. Frequently, kids will come to me and say, oh, I want the ACT. I want to take that test because, I'm a science person, but it's not really a science test. What I mean by that is you don't need much outside science knowledge in order to answer any of the science questions on the ACT. Maybe 10% of the questions, maybe 3 or 4 questions, will test outside science knowledge. So it's not a significant portion of the test. The vast majority of the test is going to be, things that require you to find data, inferring data, reading comp, and science knowledge is once again just about 3 or 4 questions. So what you'll see a lot of questions on the science section really are just like tables where they'll have a chart and they'll ask you to analyze something that's on that chart. And sometimes it could be as easy as determining which one has the highest concentration and just choosing the biggest number. Or sometimes it's a little bit more difficult. You need to solve for the average or the percent yield. But the vast majority of questions are mainly just finding data and inferring data. Reading comp and science knowledge tends to be a smaller portion of the test. So it's not about how much science you know, it's more so about your ability to understand and interpret data. So just because you're good at science doesn't necessarily mean you'll be good at the science section of the ACT. It's a myth. So let's talk a little bit about the scoring summaries. That's obviously one of the biggest differences. The SAT is out of 1,600. The ACT, on the other hand, is at a 36. And once again, there's 4 composite sections. so that you can get a 36 on all of them and they just average them out. And, $1 million question, of course, which test should a student take? And the answer is a predictable, it depends. If you do prefer a faster paced exam with easier questions, maybe the ACT is the test you should go with. If you're more of a critical thinker and you haven't taken a ton of geometry or you don't like geometry, maybe the SAT would be the better test. But the bona fide way for you to figure out which test is going to be best for you is to sit down, broken record time, take a diagnostic, take both if you can, and then I could help you, Karen can help you figure out what test is best and what the path needs to be. Best bet is take the diagnostics and figure it out from there. Turning to the initial metaphor, when it comes to standardized tests, some students are naturally either tortoises or hares, and the natural inclination tends to play the biggest role in which test is a better fit. So any questions about the ACT and the SAT before we jump into the last topic of our discussion here today, the digital SAT?
No big questions, but I was going to just mention,
Sure.
I've had students in the past kind of balk at like, oh my gosh, I got to do a diagnostic. Like it's going to take so much time. Like, do I really need to do it? And that sort of thing. I think a good analogy that I bring up is, this is a really big piece of that admission decision. And especially, if you're an athlete, this is actually a huge critical piece of it. So this is not something to kind of make a decision on willy-nilly. It's a little bit like if you are going to go buy a car, you can look at videos online or you can, look at pictures, but you're going to want to do a test drive, right? You're going to want to see how that car handles the way you drive, right? Like I might drive a different way than, my best friend. So it's really hard to make that decision unless you've taken it yourself and you go, oh, that was faster than I thought. And then when you take the SAT, you're like, oh, this actually fits me better. I'm going to do better on this one. Therefore, if I have higher test scores, I have a greater chance of possibly admission, recruitment, scholarship. All of these things get tied together. So I do think that, kind of, yes, setting aside that time to do a practice, it will only help you later. I think one of my pet peeves are seeing students that take an official SAT or ACT like 4 or 5 times. And I'm like, why would you even, like you're not really prepping yourself. Ideally, if you do this right, you do a diagnostic, you figure out which test is best for you, prep, take it once, and then be done with it. That's the way I would love my students to do it and not drag yourself through testing for like an entire year. Which is what a lot of students kind of end up doing. Like, oh, I guess I'll just try it. But another thing I tell students, like if you're going to take these tests without any sort of preparation, it's like saying, oh, look, hey, Karen, why don't you go run a marathon tomorrow? But I have not trained for a marathon. I would not get good results, right? Or let me go play in this huge rugby game tomorrow, but I've not trained with my team or prepared my body. It's the same with these college standardized tests. So you do want to make sure you take some time to prepare adequately and hopefully you'll get a good result because of it.
Yeah, definitely. And the way we sort of see it is, it's not going to be fun. No one wants to take these diagnostics. It's 8 hours of testing, which is frankly insane. And I wouldn't want to, spend a weekend doing it either. But those 8 hours of testing really do pay off for students. I've had students who wouldn't even consider the ACT, but sat down for an SAT and an ACT diagnostic, and their score was already 20% higher on the ACT. So that would essentially mean that if the student hadn't taken an ACT diagnostic and went the route of the SAT, they would need to study and make up that difference first. So if, let's say, the ACT is at 80th percentile, on the SAT, they took a diagnostic and they were scoring in the 60th percentile. Well, first, that student would need to make up ground to get to the 80th percentile so that it matches the ACT score report. That's essentially wasted time. So, I mean, a student won't need to spend that time studying for a test if they're already doing better on the other. So they'll save at least, 8, 9, 10, 20 hours,
Yeah.
starting with a test that's better for them.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I can't count the number of times it's happened. So it's worth your time. I know it's painful. It's not fun. But once you do it, it's over, and it really does help us determine what path you need to go.
Yep.
So yeah, it's worth
digital SAT.
it.
Tell us what this is all this super fun topic.
Yeah,
Tell us what this
people
is
love
about.
the digital SAT.
I
And
know.
I mean, it's coming up. Well, for international students, it's there. So all that chat about the paper-based SAT, if you're an international student, doesn't matter anymore. It's already a digital test for you. So what you hear now is what you're going to experience very shortly. In the US, next March, so March 2024, that's when the SAT goes digital, and that's when this information becomes pertinent to you. So let's take a detailed look here, because it's fun. But by fun, I mean a little scary, but it's not scary at all. I've taken both the paper-based SAT and the digital SAT, and for me, frankly, I like the digital nature a little bit better. I'll get into why I like it. But here's like a general kind of overview of what the key differences are. First, the paper-based SAT is going to be on paper, whereas the digital SAT is clearly going to be digital. This is going to be on your own computer that you're working with or watching this webinar on right now. You'll take it into school, and that's the exact computer you'll be using. The test dates are going to be the same for US students. International, you get some more test dates, which is lovely. Location doesn't change at all. It's going to be in a school or a test center. That's not going to change. Another really fun thing is that a calculator is now permitted on all sections of the exam. So there's no more no calculator section. And my favorite part of the digital SAT is that they now have a graphing calculator built into the digital app. And they're actually using Desmos, which if you're a high schooler now, you know what Desmos is. Desmos is this graphing app that schools across the world use. So it's a tool that students already are comfortable with, and I preferred that to my graphing calculator that was on my on the table. I found myself typing in the equations into Desmos, getting a response far quicker than spending time putting in that equation into my calculator. So I think this is also something that students are going to really love. And another really cool thing, I still don't understand why the SAT takes so long to get the results graded. Can take up to 3 weeks. I've seen it take up to a month for the paper-based SAT to get graded. But now scores are going to be available in a week tops. So that's a pretty big change that I think is going to be really helpful for students as well. So that's the differences between test administration, but there is also a few differences in the content. One of the big things here is that the digital SAT is going to be shorter, which is great. One, for diagnostic testing. It's not like, a ton of time anymore. And I really think with students that have accommodations, this is also going to make a pretty significant impact. If you have a 2-time accommodation for the SAT, that could be 6 hours of testing, which is grueling. But now with a digital test, if you're getting an accommodation, you can get double time. It's now a 4-hour test. So I think that's going to make a huge difference for all students, and a particular impact on students with accommodations. I think it's going to be really good for them. The sections, you're getting fewer sections. That's how they're dumbing it down to 2 hours, how they're cutting it down to 2 hours. The questions are actually going to be grouped, which I also really like. It's sort of hard to explain the cadence until you actually take the test. but essentially the questions are going to be grouped similarly. So vocab questions are going to, come first, and then after that, there's going to be reading questions. After that, there's going to be you know analysis questions. So whatever the questions are, they tend to be grouped together, which I think also will help students out in that your mind is going to be locked into how to answer that question type, and you can answer those questions, then your mind gets locked into a new question type, answer those questions. So I like that portion as well. And here's the big thing: the digital SAT is not just a digital SAT. It's not just them taking the paper test and throwing it in digital format, which a lot of people think is the case. The digital SAT is now an adaptive test, which means that it's going to change as you start answering questions. And we'll get into what that essentially means. But the more questions you answer right, the harder the test is essentially going to get. Total score for the digital SAT is still at a 1600, so no changes there. And the College Board has gone ahead and said that they think that the scores are going to be very similar. So they think if you're scoring a 1400 on the paper-based SAT, you should be able to score a 1400 on the digital SAT. They're so confident in that saying that they're similar tests that they're even saying that they'll super score across exams. So if you take a paper-based SAT and then take a digital SAT, they're saying that you can super score across both of those exams and that colleges will accept it. So the College Board is definitely confident in how this is going, and they're very confident in their new test. So you might be asking, what is adaptive testing? Now, the way it essentially works is that the test is going to be broken up into two different sets of modules, module 1 and clearly module 2. So the first module of reading and writing, for instance, is 27 questions and it's timed at 32 minutes. The second module is the same exact length, 27 questions, 32 minutes. What essentially happens is you're going to get a first module, and based on how you perform on that first module, your second module will either be a higher performing, more difficult module, or a lower performing, easier module. And that's going to lock you into a specific score range. Now, those score ranges are still not public information, but what we do know is that if you're locked into the lower scoring second module, it's gonna be pretty difficult for you to even break 600. Whereas if you get grouped into the higher module, you can get as close to 800 as possible. So it's gonna definitely lock your score into a different range. But they have the exact same thing on the math section. So what you'll see is that with the digital SAT, the way it's essentially going to work is that the first module is going to be of mixed difficulty. And then based on how you answer questions on that first module, if you get at least half of those correct, you get into the higher difficulty, which means you can gain access to a higher subset of scores. But if you answer less than half correctly on the first module, what that means, you'll be locked into the lower difficulty exam. If you're locked into the lower difficulty exams, what that essentially means is that you won't be able to really, get those higher scores. You're gonna be locked into a lower subset of scores. So this essentially means that if you're a test taker, that it takes you some time to get comfortable with the test. The digital SAT might be a little bit more difficult, and you are going to need to work through that anxiety because the first module really does dictate how you're going to do on the entire exam. So it's really important that you do well on that first module. And that's it. You now know everything you need to know about test optional policies, test blind policies, and the 3 different test formats that you're going to get accosted with: paper-based SAT, paper-based SAT, and the digital SAT. Now, the next step for you is that if you are considering any one of these exams, you can go ahead and shoot me an email, morris@arborbridge.com. I could set you up with those two diagnostics. We could have a conversation to figure out which of these two tests are best. And if tutoring is a necessary path, we could explore that as well. And we also have a ton of AP tutoring. And for Karen students in particular, they do get access to a free complimentary lesson for and whichever AP that they might be taking right now. So yeah, that's thank you for coming. Any questions, Karen?
I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to go over a couple questions that I get. So with families that have never, this is their first kid going through this. I know that with the pandemic, I think more families got comfortable with online tutoring. I don't know if you could kind of briefly just touch on how, I guess, how it works. Because I think a lot of families are like, shouldn't we go to our local, I don't know, like our neighbor down the street's really good at math, and he could tutor my son in SAT math. And so just kind of explaining that, at least what I always say is like, I mean, yes, definitely like talk to neighbor, talk to the people in your community. However, I have found there's certainly a difference in having tutors that like do this as a full-time job, not just something they do on the side. And just like in rugby, there are people I know who are really great players but aren't great coaches. And so in the same sense, even with tutoring, I might be really good at math, but it doesn't mean I can teach you how to do trigonometry or however the case, whatever it's being tested. So I don't know if you can just briefly talk about how tutoring normally, because I know I've seen, I mean, you guys track everything, and parents are really kept in the loop about how it's going, all those sorts of things.
Yeah. We get a lot of questions about that. Frankly, it's with in-person tutoring, it's going to be really hard to find the best SAT tutor in a specific town that will come to your house. At ArborBridge, we only hire the best of the best. I know this because I was one of ArborBridge's SAT tutors, and I was the best of the best. So we only hire the best of the best, and we give every student, regardless of where they are, access to that instructor. A lot of our tutors are, as Karen said, full-time tutors. This is what they do day in, day out. All they do is tutor the SAT and ACT. This is their job. Some of the staff members have been working here tutoring for longer than I have. So it's definitely important to find the right tutor. But beyond that, something that ArborBridge can provide that tutor, that's tutoring your son or daughter at home, is a really targeted approach that is different from most of the other companies out there. I have students coming to me and comparing other test prep companies all the time, and ArborBridge, what we try to do is make it so that each and every student gets a customized curriculum that's specific to them after they take a diagnostic. So if you go to another test prep company or work with your friend's neighbor, that test prep company might give your son or daughter a giant book, say, hey, you need to read this entire thing cover to cover, and you'll get a 1,500 on the exam. At ArborBridge, we recognize that a student's time is valuable, and we only teach them information that's pertinent to what they need to cover. So as soon as they take a diagnostic, we'll look to see what questions that student got wrong. We'll look to see how often they come up on the SAT, and then we'll rank them in order of importance. If a student's already covered the equation of line and they're not answering questions wrong on the equation of line, why are we going to spend 20 hours studying the equation of a line? We only teach students what they need to know in order to do well on the exam. I had a family come to me and they were comparing some other company, and they came to me, they gave me a diagnostic report, and they gave me a goal score. And that other company, I'm not going to say which one, said, hey, you need 45 hours of tutoring. I took that same exact diagnostic score, looked at their goal score, and my recommendation based on the data that we've collected was 15. Significantly less in order to get the exact same goal. And it's all because of that very targeted approach. So it's less time with really high quality tutors, and it really does make a difference. We have the data to kind of back up the claim. You
Yeah.
spend less time with ArborBridge to get the same score, if not better than other institutions.
Right. And I certainly think, the reason I think so many of my students have gone with ArborBridge is, I think I talk to my high school students, I'm like, I literally don't understand how many hours in the day you have, because so many of them have all of their commitments at school in their classes, and then you add sport on top of it. um, it's really nice for students to be able to say, okay, look, the best time for me to do tutoring is Sunday at 5:30, or something like that, versus I have to, a lot of them, if it's, say, for example, like a set class, they actually can't make those. It's Tuesdays and Thursdays at 6 o'clock, because that's when they actually have practice.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think keeping all those things in mind, and then obviously if you're considering, Morris is super easy to talk to. I mean, I would just, reach out to him, have a chat with him about where you guys are. Kind of the idea of like, here are some of the schools you're thinking, here are some of the tests, the diagnostics, if you have any you've already done, or if you need to take some, and then Morris will take care of you, and he'll make sure that everything is set up for you. And I think with that in mind, I think we are going to let you go, because I don't see anything else here. But I want to thank you so much for your time, and
Of
I'll
course.
certainly make sure to share all of your information, and hopefully we will talk soon.
Sounds
Thank you
good.
so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, no problem. It was my pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Have a good one.